Hi, folks, and welcome back to another session of Advice from Your Advocates. This is a podcast that we do to the long-term care industry and those that are interested in issues related to long-term care, dementia, Alzheimer's, and its related fields. So today I'm really excited that we have a couple folks from the Alzheimer's Association, Nicole Colley and Karen Schellberg. And we had Nicole in the office just a few weeks ago, and she was such a wealth of information. And we had her do an education event for the team members here at Manor Law Group. And we were all so impressed and really happy with the information that we asked her to come on the podcast. So I'm really excited. Nicole and Karen, welcome. And if you could each introduce yourselves and tell us a little bit more about what you do for the Alzheimer's Association.
Thanks so much for having us. I'm Nicole Colley. I am one of the local staff members to the Flint area specifically. So I work on the Flint Walk to End Alzheimer's. And then my coworker, Karen, is joining me today. I'll let Karen introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. I'm Karen Schellberg. I'm the Care Consultation Director. So I'm based out of Southfield in our Metro Detroit area. And I oversee all of our social work programs as well as our 24/7 helpline.
So one of the things that I think it's really important to talk about from the very beginning, there's a storied history of the Alzheimer's Association, and it's a great organization, but some people get confused a little bit about, what is Alzheimer's, dementia, different types of dementias. So Alzheimer's is one specific diagnosis of a category called dementia. So dementia is actually a category, and then there's specific diagnoses under the category of dementia. So is the Alzheimer's Association limited to those that have a diagnosis of Alzheimer's?
No, not at all. So we actually at the association help anybody that has any dementia or brain-related disorder. Karen, do you remember the official long name that we have that's not just Alzheimer's Association?
Yes, I was just going to say that we're technically the Alzheimer's and Other Related Disorders Association. I believe that's it.
That's great.
But
I did not know that. That's fantastic. I learned something today. I didn't expect. I never knew that there was a longer name. So tell us a little bit about the Alzheimer's Association, and then we'll get into some of the specifics. But give us a little bit of background on what the organization does and its purpose.
Yeah, I'll give a brief overview, and then I'll let Karen do more of a deep dive into some of our particular programs and that kind of thing. But basically, the Alzheimer's Association works in a lot of different ways. We also work on both research, advocacy, awareness, and fundraising efforts on both local and global levels. And then in terms of support that we offer in our local communities, we have a 24/7 helpline that's manned that people can call exactly like it says. It could be middle of the night, it could be a holiday, and it could be for something as simple as, I need a new doctor for my loved one and I'm not really sure where to go. So we can pull anything by zip code. It could be something a little bit more in depth, like you just need to call and vent, or you need to call and talk through a specific situation that you're going through with somebody. So Karen can speak a little bit more to that since she works a lot closely with the helpline. We also offer support groups, both in person in all of our local communities, as well as online support groups. And we even have a larger statewide phone option. We do education programs. And so these are something where we partner with local organizations to offer these programs. Kind of our model association-wide is this peer-to-peer model where it's the ripple effect of being able to spread and reach more people. And so the more we partner with other organizations that are willing to host an education program that we then come to teach to their new pool of people, the more we're able to keep spreading the message. We also have care consultations, which are more of a one-on-one service. So these can be done over the phone or in person based on your preference and your comfort level. But this is something where one of our social workers will sit down and chat with you about your unique family situation. I know personally, I actually did one of these for my own family during COVID, working through some things with my grandparents, and I found it extremely helpful. So I think it's probably one of those things that's maybe a little underutilized. I don't know if you would agree with that, Karen, but I think that it's a wealth of information that you can gain for your specific situation doing one of these. And then lastly, we've got social engagement programming. So this is something where people in the early stages of the disease and their families can get together with other people in the same type of situation to do social events and be able to engage with people that really understand kind of what they're going through.
Wow, that's great. That's a whole lot of great resources, and we'll try to unpack some of those a little bit. So, at Manor Law Group, we work with a lot of families. We are a dementia and Alzheimer's focused law firm, and so we do planning for folks that have. And what we realized, we started making that assertion that we're focused on dementia and Alzheimer's, I don't know, about 2-3 years ago, when we realized that, well, we'd been helping people in the long-term care industry for 15-20 years, and helping families that were dealing with this. We realized that about 80% of our clients had some form of dementia. And so we thought that, well, that's a lot easier for people to kind of wrap their head around. But because one of the things that I found interesting through the years, that sometimes we're the first call when, maybe sometimes they haven't even disclosed some of the things to their doctor. Sometimes the doctor has referred them to us, or that they just got the diagnosis. But one of the things that we've seen is how difficult it is for families to wrap their head around the whole issue of a loved one that's experiencing any form of dementia or brain disease. So where would be the first step? What would be the entry point in involving the Alzheimer's Association for a family or a family member that has a loved one that's just really trying to get their bearings for dealing with this new part of their life?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. I think the first step and the first place we always kind of direct people towards, like Nicole said, is our 24/7 helpline. So, and I can put that number in the chat. That number is 1-800-272-3900. Like I said, I'll put it in the chat as well. But it's a great first place to start, because through calling that helpline, you can get connected with whatever resources are available in your community. It can lead you to, like I said, a support group or an education program or a care consultation. When someone calls the 24/7 helpline, we receive thank you, Nicole, we receive a list of all the people who have called from our local area. And so someone local will always follow up and can give more specific local resources as well. If we have different scholarships or grants available, which we often do in the counties, we can kind of get more program specific, but really determine, do they need, have they just talked to their primary care physician and maybe they need a referral to a neurologist to get a more in-depth workup. We have, like Nicole said, we have that list of neurologists split up by county, split up by zip code. We can provide those resources. If they feel like they just want to talk to someone else, that's when we would maybe lead them towards a support group or an education program if they want to learn more about the disease. So the 1-800 number is always the best first entry into our organization. And then from there, we can, there are trained professionals who can kind of triage and figure out what services might be most beneficial for them.
That's interesting that you bring up the neurologist. I think that's very important as part of this whole process. And one of the things that I've found through the years that I find very important is trying to get a specific diagnosis. What type of dementia? And certainly from a standpoint of the family wrapping their head around it, understanding it, but also for planning for the future, legal planning, financial planning, all of these things, care planning, obviously, getting a specific diagnosis, because as we know, vascular dementia is going to present differently than Alzheimer's type dementia. It's going to have a different, flow through it. Whereas Alzheimer's might be more of a gradual decline. Vascular dementia might be drastic changes overnight sometimes, and sort of cliffs that we come over. And then there's various other types. So getting that specific diagnosis and going to the neurologist, I think, is very important. Sometimes I feel like families sometimes don't understand it, and sometimes I feel like doctors don't push for that diagnosis as much as they should. How do you feel about that from the standpoint of the importance of actually knowing what type of dementia the family is experiencing or the person is experiencing, so that they have a little bit of a shorter learning curve for wrapping their head around what to expect?
Mhm. Certainly. I think knowing that, and I think also the importance of ruling out other conditions and other things that could potentially be causing memory decline. We know, Alzheimer's disease, dementia, vascular dementia, as you mentioned, but there are, it's not just a one quick, okay, let's do this test, you have dementia, but we want to rule out other potentially reversible causes that could be contributing to the memory decline. So we know things like, for example, sleep apnea. If someone has undiagnosed and untreated sleep apnea, that can lead to memory changes. And if someone then receives treatment for that, that can sometimes really help with their memory and attention, or at least be a contributing factor to helping them live their best life at their best capacity. We know there can be vitamin deficiencies, and other, blood work needs to be done to look for other potentially reversible changes, or again, if there are things that can maybe help with cognition, an MRI needs to be done. So I think it's really important to get that thorough diagnosis, to not only know what they're dealing with, but also to rule out other potential causes of the memory decline.
That's so important. And I think drug interactions and just certain medications, sometimes over the counter medications. I know my grandfather had a reaction, and it wasn't really a reaction. It presented like dementia, but they had him on Benadryl, and he just was all confused. And as soon as they got the Benadryl through his system and didn't give him more, it was able to clear things up. And so one of the things I know that we talk about is delirium. So we have our elder law and advocacy boot camp that we do every year, which is a training for folks in the long-term care field, and they get continuing education credits. And a couple of years ago, one of our elder care coordinators, Ina Golden, who's now since retired, but she did a great presentation on delirium. It was the first time I had really actually heard that laid out quite that well. Whereas the problem sometimes with delirium, and it presents as dementia, long-term dementia, rather than something that might be reversible, is that the caregivers that are seeing them in that state don't know that they weren't like that 2 weeks ago, and might not be like that in 2 weeks. Because if they're in the ER, they get transferred and they're admitted to the hospital, and then they're sent over to rehab. And so there's all of this upheaval. Maybe there was a fall, there's people coming in and taking their blood pressure at 2 a.m. Maybe they don't have their glasses or hearing aids. Just everything going on around them causes this delirium. Maybe it's the medications, things like that, some pain medications, and the caregivers are seeing someone with dementia. They don't necessarily have the information necessary to process that this is maybe reversible. So that's a very important aspect of making sure that there's not any other medical cause, and that it might be something that we change the environment or change the medications, that we can slowly sort of get back to the previous state.
Certainly. And I think things even like an infection, like a urinary tract infection, can lead to delirium and can lead to worsening changes. But I think back to your point of getting that diagnosis, it is really important. We know that the earlier a diagnosis is given, the better, because that gives them time to plan for the future. That gives them time to contact an elder law attorney, and it gives time for the person, if it's in the early stages, for them to also be a part of that planning process. There also could be clinical trials and drug trials that maybe they'd be eligible for, that with a diagnosis they wouldn't be, or they wouldn't know about. But once they have that information, then they can go out and see, okay, are there clinical trials? Can they, should we meet with a care counselor at the Alzheimer's Association to kind of put a plan together? What do I want long term? What are my wishes? So I think having that early diagnosis, having that knowledge, learning about the disease, connecting with others is really important, just for that long term path and being able to plan for the future.
I loved something that Nicole had said a little bit earlier about you can actually call the helpline to vent. And I think that's such an important resource because we've had family members that will come in, typically a spouse that's dealing with a spouse with dementia, some form of dementia, and they will come in and they are at the end of their rope. They cannot take it anymore. We try to give them resources and options for planning for the next stage. And then they'll have a couple of good days and they will, say no, because they're thinking maybe a placement into a care setting or something like that. But then they'll have a couple of good days and say, no, no, we're going to hold out. We're going to, keep my husband at home, my wife at home for longer. And I think having that resource to help maybe get where there is some form of an outlet where they can call and talk to somebody who's knowledgeable, I'm not going to give them what I call the barbershop advice or the hair studio advice where it's he'll be fine, he's just getting cranky or he's just getting grumpy, he's whatever the neighbor might say, things like that. Having a resource to talk to somebody that actually understands a little bit about what they're going through. And I think that's such an important resource. We've started giving our clients that number to say, okay, look, if it's midnight and you don't know what to do, and maybe even if your spouse is sleeping now, but you've just had such a terrible day and you're just at the end of your rope and you just need somebody to talk to that will understand you, because your kids might not understand what you're going through, and your neighbor and your barber might not understand what you're going through. So talk a little bit more about that. They don't even necessarily need resources, they just need someone to talk to that understands what they're going through.
Yep, absolutely. And we have, there are trained and licensed social workers and counselors on the phone too. So we do, you can call, as you mentioned, for that basic INR, but if they really need just that person who understands, who has knowledge, who can listen and maybe provide them with some information, to help in the future. If they also encounter a similar difficult situation, we have those counselors who are available 24/7. And then, as I mentioned before, we get a report of everybody who calls locally from our area. And so we're sure to follow up with them as well to see if there are any additional resources that we can provide. But it is, sometimes family members say either I don't have anyone to talk to, or maybe I call my daughter all the time and I just, I want someone else to be able to vent to. That number is a great place to start.
How do you help families that might have, so I've had this happen many times where I can tell that the spouse is exhausted and overwhelmed and not sleeping properly, not taking care of their own health. And the kids come in who might not be around very often, might have flown in from out of town, they've only saw a small segment of it. How do you help when there's the families that are sort of just in denial and saying, no, mom can take care of this, it's all fine, we don't need any help, we don't need Alzheimer's Association, we don't need to learn about this, because dad can take care of mom or mom can take care of dad. They've been doing it for 57 years already, and they just don't have any sense of the demands that are placed on a spouse when their spouse has a form of dementia and it's getting progressively worse.
Yeah, I think, education about the disease, education about caregivers, and, are a lot of statistics about caregivers, and oftentimes caregivers do neglect their own physical health. They're taking their loved one to so many doctor's appointments, they just push theirs to the side. And we talk about, just like on an airplane, when you put on your oxygen mask before you put on the person next to you, you have to take care of yourself if you want to continue taking care of your loved one. And so really emphasizing, the importance of caregiver burnout. I mean, caregiving is a 24/7 job. If you're not actively, providing that care, you're thinking about it, you're planning, you're worrying, whatever it might be. And so letting them know that there are resources. That's why we have resources for caregivers. This is why we have caregiver support groups. This is why we have, respite scholarships. Respite is so, so, so important, making sure they get that break during the day. And, we know it's so important. And that's why we're able to offer these scholarships to help pay for day programs or in-home care. And so I think, and knowing too that this disease, it's not just, it can last many, many years. And so, the importance of putting self-care techniques in earlier so that they kind of become a practice and a routine, and they know, the importance of taking care of themselves. So I think a lot of it is just education about the disease, about caregiver stress, about the resources that the Alzheimer's Association has available for caregivers, and providing that education. Oftentimes family members don't get it, or they don't get it overnight, or it might take a while. And so just continuing to, provide those resources, particularly to the primary caregiver, whoever that might be.
Yeah, I think that's really important. We see folks all the time. I think people have a perception, and this is probably true in some law firms, but the perception is you're only really going to the lawyer to talk about money and how we're going to pay for whatever we're going to pay for, or yeah, those types of things. And that is, of course, an aspect of what we do, is trying to find government resources to pay for home care, or pay for daycare, or pay for facility care, and through veterans benefits or Medicare or Medicaid or other local resources. But a big part of that is dealing with the healthy spouse, or the caregiver spouse, I guess would say, or caregiver child, caregiver granddaughter, and making sure that they're taking care of themselves, and making sure the other family members give them, understand what it is that they're going through. Because when we talk about this, I always ask if it's a spouse in particular, I say, well, and then they'll always think this is funny coming from a lawyer, but how are you sleeping? Are you sleeping okay? Oh no, I can't ever sleep because he's up all night. He gets up and he sleeps during the day and he's up all night. And okay, well, we've got to find resources for that. And some of the times it is true that we're often finding government resources to pay for care, whether it's in-home care or care outside of the home. But one of the things that we also do is help them decide how to use their money to pay for it. So one of the big questions we have is, okay, well, which account should I take the money out of to pay for the home care worker, or to pay the granddaughter, or things like that. And there are important decisions to make, and sometimes there's tax reasons and other reasons why we should be using different resources. So it is one of those things that it's all encompassing, I think, and the families it's very easy to get overwhelmed. So I understand why caregivers are the caregiver spouse in particular are the ones that are feeling all the stress. So what resources might you have? I understand the call-in line. I would like to hear a little bit more about the assessment that you mentioned. I think that's very interesting. You say that maybe that's a little bit underused resource that the Alzheimer's Association has. But tell me a little bit more about that, because I wasn't actually aware of that option until recently.
Are you referring to the care consultation program
Yes.
for a social worker? Yeah.
Yes.
And Nicole, feel free to jump in at any time. I feel like I'm monopolizing. So the care consultation program. So we have licensed social workers here in Southfield, and we can meet with anybody throughout the state. So we can either do in person, depending on the county they live in. We can even come out to the home and meet with families and caregivers in the home. And then we can do virtual via Zoom or phone as well. And so this, and oftentimes, it is kind of underutilized, or people wait until they're kind of in crisis mode and something has happened and then they're calling us. And so the care consultation program is really nice because it pairs a family member, with a social worker. The social worker will come and will complete a full assessment. And this assessment is both of the caregiver as well as the person with dementia. So we don't necessarily need to have the person with dementia in the room with us, because that can often be upsetting and triggering too, depending on where they're at in the disease process. And so we will meet with the caregiver. It can also be a whole family team. So as you mentioned, if there's a spouse caring for a husband or wife and adult children are in town, we often will set up meetings when as many children are in town as possible, if they all want to be a part of that process. And so we ask a lot of questions about the caregiver, their medical health, their mental health, just what they're able to do, what supports they have in the community, what their thoughts are about placement, how confident do they feel in dealing with certain behaviors or challenges, bathing or incontinence, things that might occur towards that, throughout the disease process. And then we ask questions about the person living with dementia. So what are they still able to do? What are their health conditions? And then from that assessment and from kind of understanding what it is that they need, we put together what's called a person-centered care plan. And so in this care plan with the family, we come up with goals and action steps. And those goals can be anything from increasing respite for the caregiver. It can be planning for the future and long-term care planning. It can be if there's safety issues, maybe the person is wandering. So what can we do to ensure the person's safety in the home, enrolling them in our medical alert program. It can be if there's a challenging behavior, kind of communication challenges, we can create a goal around that. So it really depends on what it is that the family, if they just want increased education about the disease and they want to connect with other caregivers, maybe connecting them with some of the resources at the Alzheimer's Association. And so we put together this care plan with goals, with kind of specific action steps on how to reach those goals. And then that guides future sessions in conversations and helping them kind of reach those goals, whatever they might be. And then we review the care plan and update it if needed. So it's a short-term program. Usually caregivers are in it for about 6 months on average, but it can be shorter or longer depending on what their needs are. So we try to keep it as individualized as possible.
That sounds like an amazing resource, and I'm really happy to hear that you can involve the family in that. So often the family either just doesn't understand, or particularly the spouse is sometimes is very close to it. And what I mean by that is that they've been together for 57 years or whatever it is, and that they're just, oh, he's just being stubborn. Okay, it's probably a little bit more than that. Oh, he's just being grumpy today. Okay, oh, he's pretending he doesn't know me. I hear all these things, or arguing about money when the person clearly doesn't even understand the concept of money sometimes. And being able to go in and kind of hear those things and maybe provide some insight. And I know you guys have education resources too, to educate, to say, okay, this is more than just 50 years of marriage and the back and forth of married people kind of getting grumpy with each other. Sometimes this is a different thing, and sometimes spouses, because it was a gradual thing, especially with an Alzheimer's type dementia, it might have been a gradual progression, that they're not really seeing it. They're just not fully grasping the enormity of the changes that are going on with the person with dementia. Nicole, I'm very interested to hear on a personal level. You said that you were able to go through this with your family and your grandparents. Can you give us a little insight on what that looked like as someone who was sort of receiving those services, or a participant in those services?
Yeah, I was going to bring that up actually as an example, because I'm not an example of somebody who did a very in-depth one, just because we weren't that far along in the process of the disease yet. But it was during COVID as well, and we went through the process of having to downsize my grandparents from their 4-bedroom home into a condo, and figuring out, how do we go about that and be as sensitive as possible to grandma, because she is still so independent and takes care of everything. But they were at a point where she couldn't do things on her own because grandpa wasn't able to help her anymore, because he just can't do the things that he used to do. So how do we have those conversations? How do we make that happen? And being able to, I think, just talk with a social worker about, okay, this is what my grandmother is like. This is the point that my grandfather is at that disease process. Like, typically, this is how she responds to these situations. How do I mindfully, because I'm close to this and I do get aggravated because it's my own family, right? Like, we all get that way. Like, So how do I approach this situation the best way possible? And knowing that this is probably the reaction we're going to get, what type of advice do you have for like how we should go about the next steps and what things should we be thinking about moving forward? So if we're doing this now, what X, Y, and Z should we then be thinking about doing next? And it was really helpful to have that feedback and then being able to give that to like the other adult children in the family as well to have us all on the same page and have us moving forward together.
Yeah. Uh, one of the things that you talk about having to downsize and all of that. And one of the things I'll frequently say during presentations or talking to families is, and I say this lovingly, this is not being critical, is that I call it two halves making a whole. And two halves making a whole where one of the spouses may have some memory issues and the other spouse has some physical issues. And together they are able to get by. And it's a good thing, it's a positive thing. And we see this all the time. And then can be a very loving situation where they're making up for each other's concerns. And the thing I always say about that is, okay, great, the two halves do make a whole and we can get by, but we need to now address what's next when that next shoe drops. Let's get in front of
Something
this.
happens, what will that look like then?
Exactly. Perfect way to say that. When something happens, what will that look like? Yeah, great. You mentioned also that this was during the pandemic. Can you want to either or both of you kind of talk a little bit about how things have shifted because of the pandemic? One of the things I noticed is certainly early on in the first 2020 into 2021, things have changed a little bit, but initially a lot of folks that needed long-term care and maybe were even in care settings or nursing homes or memory cares, their families brought them home. They took them out and brought them home because more people were working from home. They felt like they were able to do it because they were working remotely, or maybe they were quarantining and not working at all. And so there was a lot more people that were caring for their loved ones in their home, in their kids' home, things like that. And the issues that comes up with, have you noticed that trend, or did you notice that trend? I think it's kind of starting to go back the other way, because I think that can only go on for so long. But has that something that you noticed, and how have you kind of adapted accordingly with regard to the pandemic rules and sometimes not being able to go into home, things like that?
Well, I think even more than that, to seeing people who maybe were thinking about placement and kind of moving in that direction, hadn't made the decision, and then all of a sudden we're in lockdown and it's impossible, next to impossible. You can't tour facilities. They're the fears of the pandemic. I mean, we know that in 2020 compared with the 5 years before, there was a 17% increase in Alzheimer's death because of a lot of different factors. Those with Alzheimer's often have other health conditions, makes them more vulnerable to COVID. And then living in those communal settings, nursing homes were really greatly affected. And so I think still being able to provide them. So obviously, when COVID started, we all locked down as well. We worked from home. We weren't able to meet with families in person or go out in the community and do education programs and support groups. So we had to really pivot and switch to virtual. So we were still, we knew the impact it was having, whether, like you said, family members now all of a sudden bringing their loved ones home, or the opposite, not being able to visit their family members. I mean, we heard so many stories about people whose loved ones were in nursing homes and passed away at the beginning of COVID, and the family members were never able to see them or to say goodbye in person because no visitors were allowed. And so really working with families with those, not being able to see their loved ones and those restrictions, or if they brought them home, what did that look like in terms of, if they were working from home, what support did we need to provide? And it was also hard, to bring in home care. Oftentimes people felt very uncomfortable having someone come into their home because they didn't want to put their loved one at risk. So I think there were so many different challenges around COVID. And like I said, we were still fortunate that we were able to pivot. We were able to offer support groups and education programs virtually, as well as care consultations. So we continued our care consultations. We offered those either by phone or by Zoom. We would do phone check-ins with people who were maybe involved in some of our services, pre-COVID, just to kind of keep connected with them as well. So I think a lot of challenges and many different areas, and not being able to visit or see their loved ones if they were still in a facility was definitely a big challenge.
Do you remember, Karen? I feel like we talked as a team at some point about calls to the helpline. And I know that when COVID first hit and everyone was kind of figuring out like what's going on and what does the world look like right now, we kind of didn't see as many calls for a little bit, but then we started seeing kind of an increase. And I think that Robert's example of families that maybe brought their loved one home thinking like, oh, I don't want them in a COVID setting, I'll just keep them home with me. And then all of a sudden, like reality hit and it was like, wow, this is a lot harder than I thought it was going to be. I'm curious how many calls we got in regards to that and maybe if that was an increase that we saw.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I don't know like the exact numbers, but definitely, like you said, people who maybe haven't been caring for their loved one full time, or even, a loved one maybe not in a facility, but maybe they're in a separate home. And again, if they had home care coming in to reduce exposure, maybe they brought them into their home. Okay, we can just all kind of hunker down together, be together. And then yes, those increasing behaviors, or people maybe who went to a day program during the day, even something as simple as that. I mean, day programs shut down initially. And so the caregiver who maybe would get a break, or the person with dementia had that routine of, okay, I get up, I go to the day program. Maybe they saw it as their work and they went to work every day. Now all of a sudden they're not able to leave the house. They are inside. And so you see maybe increased agitation and an increase in some of those behaviors where maybe before they had that outlet of the day program that they no longer have. And so learning how to adjust, how to keep them, mentally and socially and physically active and engaged in the home when that maybe wasn't a concern before COVID.
I think that's really interesting. And, we still occasionally, but up until the last few months, it was a pretty common scenario where I'd have an older couple come in and they would comment that this would be one of the few times that they had left their house in the last 2 years, that they weren't leaving to do any socialization. They weren't leaving to go to the senior center. They weren't even going shopping. Some family would pick up their shopping for them or whatever. And when they came to see their lawyer, was one of the first times they'd left their house, or one of the few times they'd left their house in over 2 years. And that's got to be, very difficult and just a whole different kind of lifestyle than what folks imagined they'd be doing and had been doing. And hopefully they can get back to where they can get the interaction. I think social interaction and social engagement is so important, whether there's dementia or not. What I find, one of the things that when families are struggling with the question and they really do kind of know that they're not going to be able to provide the care in the home, and they do need to look at some kind of caregiving setting, whether it's assisted living or memory care or nursing homes, one of the things that I try to help them wrap their head around is sometimes I see my clients getting better, having their memory get better once they move into a care setting, because now they're interacting with more people. They have more activities. They have more interactions. They have a variety of foods. They have, just a different thing rather than being pretty much confined to their home, having maybe a couple of people that they interact with on a regular basis, and having even their partner, their spouse, be a caregiver rather than a spouse. All of their time is eaten up by being a caregiver rather than being there to listen and talk and be a spouse. And so I do find that it is really important to have that interaction with people, the socialization, whether you're a person that likes to be alone or not. It's a really important aspect.
Mm-hmm.
That's definitely a thing. I mean, I think, Robert, I don't know if I told you in the past, but prior to joining the association, I worked in long-term care and memory care for about 10 years. And one of the things when we were bringing like a new resident into a facility and we would sit down and talk with families, there's that common feeling of guilt that some people have of, I thought I would take care of my mother forever, and I never thought I would put her in a home, or I always promised I would never put her in a home.
Right.
And a lot of the conversations that I used to have with families would be around like those feelings of guilt and helping them understand that you truly are helping them by doing this. Like it's not always the best decision for everybody, but if you've decided that that's what's best, like you said, there are cases where things actually do increase and get more positive because they do have so much more social interaction. And sometimes even the relationship between the loved one and the affected person can get better because instead of that loved one just being focused on caregiving all the time, all of a sudden they have the freedom to focus on being a daughter or being a spouse or, just truly being there and being present and visiting and having good visits when they come and not dealing with all of the bad 24/7 as well. And so I think that that's definitely a thing too.
And like you said, oftentimes that guilt that comes with, oh, I promised I'd always take care of my husband or my wife or my mom. I always say you are still taking care of them. It's just, it looks a little bit different now. And you're caring for them in a different way by ensuring that they have everything they need. And it might not be at home, but you're still caring for them. And, like Nicole said, going back to that previous relationship because somebody else is responsible for the day-to-day care, and so they can go back to being whatever daughter, spouse, whoever that might be.
Some of my favorite stories, and I've heard this story many, many, many times about someone with dementia that is still physically able, very physically able, and they go into a care setting where they're living at a care setting, and their brain is telling them that they're now working there. And so they're around just helping all the other residents there because so they help them eat and they help them get their meals and they help them. And in their mind, this is now their job. And I just love that because they needed purpose, they wanted purpose, and they were very, very happy. And I've seen this so many times and families just being surprised. And often it was somebody that was in some form of a caregiving role or a serving role in their previous, employment, and they now have, significant enough dementia that they really need 24-hour supervision, 24-hour care. But they go into a care setting, and then they really now have more purpose because they're helping the other residents there, and I've seen it many, many times. Let's talk a little bit about some of the other things that you mentioned, the education and the support groups. I really think the importance of support groups. It seems difficult, I think, for people to acknowledge that that's going to be a positive for them, but I think it can be really, really helpful to be around others that are experiencing the same difficulties that you are. And so tell us a little bit more about how the support groups and how you've done it during COVID, and that they have to be in person, or are there ones in person, and what other educational opportunities do you have out there?
Yes, I think support groups are just a wonderful way to connect, and I often say, I can provide education and tips and techniques, but oftentimes talking to other people who are going through the same exact thing that you are right now or something similar. I think being able to talk to others who are also caregiving and, connecting with other people and just getting that emotional support so they know they're not alone. It can be very isolating, this disease. You can feel very alone when you're caregiving, especially if you're doing it 24/7. And to know that there are others who are also going through this, to learn from other caregivers about how they're handling certain situations. And so, yes, during COVID, we did kind of switch to a virtual phone format, which did allow some people who maybe weren't able to connect with others pre-COVID because maybe there wasn't a support group right in their area, they could connect. But I think there is something really valuable about being in person and actually being in a room with other caregivers. And so we have shifted back. We do still offer phone and virtual support groups. They meet about once a month. Some might meet a little bit more than that, but being able to have that connection to build that community So we do still offer virtual. And then we have some specific support groups too. So we have support groups for people who are diagnosed with younger onset. So younger onset dementia is a diagnosis before the age of 65. And so that often comes with other challenges. And so I think being able to connect with other younger onset caregivers who, maybe they're getting this diagnosis at a different stage in their life. So we have a specific support group for that. We also have support groups for people who have been diagnosed themselves, who are in the early stages, so they can talk with others who have also received a diagnosis and communicate about the challenges and frustrations. So in those support groups, people with a diagnosis meet in one group, and then care partners meet in another group at the same time. So we have a lot of options: virtual, phone, in person, and it's really a great way to connect with others. And I saw someone commented in the chat that they had also attended a meeting and learned so much from attending these meetings. Thank you, Bridget, for your feedback. I think the group, we have trained support group facilitators so they can provide a wealth of knowledge and information along with the others who are also caregiving.
I think too, just to speak to a little bit about, like you mentioned, training I get a lot of people in the community that, might say, oh, our facility or our company is interested in starting a support group. And they think that like our staff is just going to come run these support groups everywhere. And obviously you can't be everywhere. So it's that same, like that ripple effect I was talking about before, right? We train volunteers to do this, but speaking from that side of things as someone who used to be a volunteer and was trained to do support groups and did a couple in various facilities, I think the association does a really good job of kind of teaching you how to deal with different scenarios and that kind of thing, but also teaching you, I think some people have this concept that they're going to go to a support group and they're going to get like all this education. And so much more of it is about just getting the people that are in the group to talk together. And really, like, we want our leaders to be talking less because we want the people that are there to be bonding and talking more with each other and giving each other that advice. And so I think that that's one thing that the association does a really good job with, kind of teaching you as a facilitator. This is when you should step in, and this is when you should not. And this is kind of how we want you to lead things. So I think that that's a really neat aspect.
Yeah, I think that's great. That it is the training the volunteers, and that way then you can have more support groups. And I know that we're interested in trying to get something going locally here and getting some volunteers trained. We might even have some volunteers for you that could help be facilitators. So I forgot to introduce at the beginning the invisible person behind the camera. Just a voice was Savannah. And so Savannah, if you have any questions or comments that you wanted to add, we are recording this live, so there are some folks that are live asking and putting in comments.
Hello, it's Savannah. We did have one question, and Karen did answer the question, but I'll still just go ahead and read it out loud. This was a comment / question about the CCC classes, which that stood for the Confident Caregiver, I believe. I'm having a hard time scrolling up in my question box. Like there it is. Creating confident caregivers. Karen mentioned that those classes are no longer offered, but some of the area agencies on aging might offer those or something similar. If you would like information on how to contact an area agency on aging near you, just reach out to us after the recording.
Yeah, I think that's great. And you do tell me a little bit more about, and I'm going to wrap things up here in a few minutes, but tell me a little bit more about other educational things that the association does.
Yes, we have various education programs on different topics. So a lot of them are just one-time programs. So everything from the 10 warning signs, understanding Alzheimer's and dementia, specific topics on communication and behaviors. We have a legal and financial program as well. We also have some 3-part series. So Living with Alzheimer's is a series, and that's actually split up into Living with Alzheimer's for the early stages, middle stages, and late stages. So that's a 2 or 3-part series that when we partner with other organizations, sometimes we'll offer them kind of 3 weeks in a row on a certain day or evening. And these are free to the community. We have them in person, we have them via Zoom. We also usually host 2 conferences each year. So we have a fall conference and a spring conference. We have a fall conference that's coming up. And this year, for the first time since 2020, we're going to be offering kind of a hybrid in-person and virtual approach. So if people still don't feel quite comfortable getting out, in the community, they can log in virtually. And then we also have an option to do in person as well. And then there are pre-recorded education seminars on our website. So if you go to alz.org, you can find those same topics that are pre-recorded, so you can kind of take them at your own leisure. But again, as Nicole mentioned, just, we, in order to get out into the community, we're trying to kind of recruit more volunteers, train volunteers to give those programs so we can make them as available as possible.
Nicole, do you want to give a quick pitch for the walk, the Alzheimer's walk that I think is coming up in the fall?
Yeah, I think that, a lot of the things that we've talked about, a lot of these different steps that you can take and just the topic in general is really hard for a lot of people to dive into at first. The idea of calling the 800 number or going to a support group for the first time. A lot of people really struggled with that even for a couple of years before they're really ready to do it. And then sometimes it's like, oh God, why didn't I do this 3 years ago? This is so helpful. But sometimes just having an event that you can go to and just meet other people going through the same thing is a lot easier to think about maybe doing. And so our walks are a really good place for that. We have 24 of them across the state of Michigan. So in our area in Genesee County, the Flint Walk takes place right downtown Flint in the Flat Lot. And this year it's going to be October 8th. And so kind of my thing that I always say about Walk Day that I love is it feels like a big support group or a big hug. There's my favorite thing to see every year is the people that clearly have never been there before, or maybe haven't experienced something quite to that level. And like Karen has said a couple of times, and we probably all have at some point today, this disease can make you feel so alone and it can be so isolating. And so when you take that maybe easier first step and you show up at an event and there's hundreds of people all wearing purple that are all there for the same thing, that know exactly what you're going through, it can be such a good way to get connected with some other people and have a little bit of fun. When there's really so many dark moments with this disease as well, it's a way to kind of celebrate our loved ones and have a little bit of fun together too. So
yeah, it really is a great event. And speaking of events, I do have an announcement. This is kind of fun. So I mentioned earlier that we have our annual Elder Law and Advocacy Boot Camp, which is typically for people that are in the long-term care industry, and whether they need continuing education credits or not. We offer 5 continuing education credits. And we have, the announcement is the event is going to be held next year, 2023. It'll be our 9th annual. April 21st, Friday, April 21st, 2023, from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. And we'll be offering, we're applying for continuing education units for nursing home administrators, social workers, and case managers. I believe, that this is a live presentation, but many people will be watching or listening to the recorded event. That currently there might be some early bird tickets available, but depending on when you're listening to this podcast. So thank you so much, Nicole and Karen. So great information, such a great organization. And thank you for your time and the work that you do.
Thank you for having us.
Until the next time that we have the podcast, thanks everybody.